joining online at YouTube. So Professor Ilana Löwy is the research director at the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS. Trained as a biologist and as a historian of science and medicine, her research focuses on the relationship between laboratory investigations and clinical practices during the 20th century. So this includes bacteriological revolution, the history of bacteriology and immunology, the history of medicine and biomedical sciences in so-called peripheral countries, Latin America and Eastern European countries, and gender and biomedicine. So these topics, of course, all come together in vital ways in this new book. Today, we will hear first a bit about the book from Ilana, and then hear short responses by 3 expert respondents. So these experts are eminently Googleable, so I won't tell you much about them, but I will just say the run of show. So first, we'll hear from Professor Ann Kelly, normally at King's, but now in Princeton, New Jersey. Then from Rishita Nandagiri, who is another one of our own, here joining us in person. And then finally, Professor Raina Rapp, joining us from New York City. And then we'll have a broader discussion, followed by a wine reception for those of you joining in person. So without further ado, Ilana.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I'm extremely happy to be here. And of course, you know, I'm affiliate professor here, and it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to all of you. And thank you so much, Anna, Rishita, and Lucy, for organizing this event. It's wonderful. So I try to be short. So I'm going to speak, just show you a little bit what was my project doing this book. So how I change it? Wait a minute.
Right here.
Yes. Okay. So first of all, can you show the book? Yeah. Probably the most distinguished, no, even not probably, surely, the most distinguished things about the book is the cover. Because it's the reproduction of Paula Rego, and you know, I am, as you say, garden variety academic, but Paula Rego is a very great artist. And he was kindly, I got the permission to reproduce everything. So I wanted to say something about the cover. So the cover is a change from, and Paula Rego, among other things, she was a Portuguese artist, died 2 years ago. She was, besides being a wonderful artist, she has a very strong feminist engagement. She militated for the abolition of the restriction of abortion in Portugal, and make a very dramatic series about what abortion is, and it was, presumably, has a really lot of weight in Portugal to see women, what is really clandestine abortion, what kind of horror it is. So she made the book, the image on the cover is a comment on a very well-known picture, which is a National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, which is the first mass in Brazil. It's the Christianization of Brazil, and so you see it's the Indian who came in the cross, and the version that Paula Rego made of it is a very, you know, it's the first one, it's a pregnant woman, and as I read it, there are a lot of complex symbols, but as I read it, it's one of them, one of the benediction in grace of Christianization of Brazil was sexual repression of women, because there was a control of women's sexuality that did not exist in pre-conquest Brazil before the Portuguese came and Christianized Brazil. So, okay, so this is the image on the cover, and I think it's more or less tells some ways summarize the story of the book. Okay, so what's happened? There was in fall 2015, people in Recife, Brazil, found doctors, gynecologists, and obstetrician found out something that was very surprising. A lot of children born in very severe brain malformation with microcephaly, big parts of the brain were missing. And then they found that there were other brain anomaly, And this was something that you see these children, very typical images of the children with very deformed head because anterior part of the brain is missing. And this was in one of the epicenter. One of the things that I started to work, as a normal STS, a science of study and technology subject, and then we gradually realized that the epidemics of Zika, of the children born, they were nearly exclusively born of women from low-income groups, and disproportionately for non-white women, but especially women from very low income. And so, okay, the question is, they say, this is a quotation from New York Times, 97% of the children with congenital Zika syndrome were born of families of lower socioeconomic status and only 3% of high economic status. Okay? So you can say, okay, that's normal. Poor people always get more sick. And you can say that people are more exposed to mosquitoes and less able to protect themselves, poor people, because they live without air conditioning, they live in places with poor hygiene, they have lower general resistance, and they have multiple infections, so they were lower resistance and higher risk of transplacental transmission of the Zika virus. But class difference, it was 97 and 3, it's huge. And class difference for congenital Zika syndrome, CZS is congenital Zika syndrome, was much higher than for other diseases that was transmitted. Zika is transmitted by mosquito. I should have said in the beginning for people who don't know. But it was much higher for CZS than other diseases vehiculated by Zika and other anomalies. There are a lot of other diseases that are vehiculated by the same mosquitoes. Aedes aegypti, yellow fever, but there is not much yellow fever now because of the vaccine. But dengue fever, chikungunya, West Nile, and all these diseases are more frequent in poor people, but they will be 1.5 times, 2 times, not 97 and 3%. So this was the question that's kind of opened my investigation, but became KLO, and my book claims that the difference can be explained by stratified reproduction, which means the difference in control of fertility, prevention of sex transmission, access to prenatal diagnosis, and access to selective abortion. Now, abortion is illegal in Brazil in general, and certainly more difficult for fetal indication. So, well, why it doesn't move anymore? Oh, shoot, sorry. No, it doesn't move. Otherwise, sorry about it. Yeah, okay, now it should be, okay. So this was the propaganda of Brazilian government. The main idea was people should be made responsible. People, mainly women, because who is cleaning the house, should be more, eliminate stagnant water, close the trash, take water of plants, clean area around the plants. By the way, now you have a huge epidemics of dengue in Brazil, started just this year, and the government make the same message. Be responsible, clean your environment, take care. And this is my favorite poster. It was all over the place when I work in Fiocruz. Zika zero. A mosquito is not stronger than the whole country, which is an especially ridiculous statement because, of course, mosquito is stronger than the country. So there's even no doubt about it, the mosquito is stronger. It was kind of fun. So, and this is a typical favela. Try to clean, clean the water plants, close your trash. This is the favela, by the way, is just facing the biggest, I work in I'm associated also in Fiocruz, which is the big medical research center in Rio de Janeiro. And this favela is just facing the National School of Public Health. So you have the National School of Public Health on one side of the road, and on the other side of the road is this photo. So try to clean it. Good luck. Anyway, so you, of course, poor people were much more exposed to mosquito. It still doesn't explain 95 and 7%. So you can say that a problem with the very severe, most of the children with Zika, congenital Zika syndrome, has very severe impairment. Now, there are two things that are important. One, that pregnant women who get infected with Zika, the chances to get Zika syndrome are not very high. They didn't know it in the beginning of the epidemic, but then they learn it's not like rubella, for example. It's not like German measles. German measles, if you get it early in pregnancy, it's more than 50% chance of malformation. For some, up to 80% if you take long term. For Zika, it will be 1 to 5%. It's not exactly clear, but it depends on because they don't enter it, but it was very difficult to learn what exactly the risk is, because the diagnosis is not certain of Zika. But anyhow, if you see, by the contrast, so the woman who is pregnant and got Zika, she is in higher risk, but the risk is not very high. So now the risk, what you can see, this is second and third trimester brain. You can see it much later in pregnancy. And you can see the very severe brain malformation starting 20 weeks of pregnancy. Not earlier, because earlier you don't see earlier than 18 weeks, you cannot see the development of the brain. So what are the possibilities? First of all, of course, not get infected. Second, don't have infected sexuality, because Zika is also transferred by sexual relationship. So be careful if women who have, especially if you think that you're pregnant or may be pregnant, use protection, use preservative, which was not done. But in Brazil, they didn't spoke at all. They only spoke about mosquito. In Puerto Rico, when it was a part of the United States, and they also have the mosquito, they spoke a lot about sexual transmission. So that was one difference. But once you are in Zika region, in place that you have high incidence, and a woman is pregnant, she can go pregnant test. She can go test if she was infected in pregnancy, and then she could undergo a very careful monitoring through ultrasound. And that's what they did, for example, in French, what we call department, when they have Zika. So they make very severe monitoring. But abortion in Brazil is illegal. What does it mean it's illegal? It's illegal to those who don't have money. It means upper-class women who were scared, got pregnant. First of all, they have upper-class women during the peak of epidemic could have much better possibility not to get pregnant at all, because they have better access to contraception and better power to negotiate with their partner not to be pregnant. But if they got pregnant, then they can get tested if they got Zika. And if they got Zika, they could be monitored. And if they had severe fetal anomaly, they could elect not to have the child. But you know, this was possible only to women who really have money. It's expensive. All this test, monitoring, and illegal abortion. It's perfectly possible to make a legal abortion in Brazil, but it's really expensive. Somehow less expensive solution sometimes is to go to a country where it is legal. So once it was Miami, but now it's the United States became complicated. So they go to other Latin American country, or with a few American countries, like Uruguay or now Argentina, or they go to Europe or to Canada or place you can get an abortion. Anyhow, so this is the problem. One explanation. But on the other hand, having abortion for fetal anomaly was even not discussed in Brazil. They say there were some feminists who say we maybe can have abortion for risk early in pregnancy. But abortion for fetal anomaly was no, because it was considered to be eugenic abortion. You choose to have a child with an anomaly, and there is a real cool, this picture is the entrance of the biggest maternity hospital in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, which was specialized in the difficult. And this is kind of, the maternal love is all over the place. All the pictures there are all, it's all about maternal love. So say, maybe don't have child with severe brain anomaly. It was not only question to be able to choose, it was even not question you be able to discuss. It was a complete silence on this subject, which does not mean that they were not. I mean, one of our, if you spoke privately with gynecologists, you say, yes, of course, women who have children with severe brain anomaly elected abortion upper class. But don't quote me. Please don't tell it. You can know it. So, okay, these are the typical image of a waiting room in Zika clinic. I mean, those children, children with severe Zika syndrome, they have very, very severe brain anomaly. They have, at 5 years, many of them are evaluated of mental age of 3 months. They have, and not only this, but they suffer from convulsion. They suffer from all kind of, they cry non-stop. They have all kind, because they have convulsion, they give anticonvulsion drugs, but the anticonvulsion drugs make them completely apathic. It's really extremely different, and those are poor women who does get very, very little help to take care of these severely handicapped children. So, okay, this is the clinic of having Zika. And there was a wonderful, there was self-organization of this woman. And one was the most powerful organization. Zika was mainly in the northeast of Brazil. It was an organization from Recife, capital of Pernambuco, but then it was called Mothers of Angels. When this is a whole political program already, because there was a split of an organization that was called Organization of Children, some kind of neutral name, I forgot, but children with handicaps. And there was a split, and they called Mother of Angels, and they became organized. And this was a very, very, there was a WhatsApp group, and they have a wonderful self-help group encouraging each other and having tips how to do and how to deal with these children. And this was really extremely good, and then they became political organization. And in fact, in Recife, when they were especially active, they did got from municipality all kind of help. The problem is this was not enough, and especially if you are not in big city and you are not in place but in organization, the mothers in other places get more or less nothing. But anyhow, they were able to pass a law that passed in 21 that grants children with officially recognized congenital Zika syndrome a pension for the whole life, help. The pension is very low. It's about $220. The cost of life in Brazil is not extremely different. The cost of life, let's say, in the United States, so on here, so it's really very little, but they get something. But there was a huge debate whether children with similar disabilities, like brain palsy or other severe neurological defect, are they entitled to the same kind of compensation? The decision was absolutely not. And the argument was, the mother's argument was, Zika was the failure of the state because they don't eliminate the mosquito. Child born with cerebral palsy, it's an accident of pregnancy or of childbirth, state is not responsible. So the children with other things didn't get nothing, and I just finish, it's my last slide, to say the Zika, one of the conclusions of my book is that the Zika is the invisibility of embodied privilege. So this was usually when we speak about poverty, we speak about women, people who don't have access. We speak about poverty, we speak about lack of access, lack of treatment, lack of possibility to be helped, but we never speak, much less speak about privilege. Privileged people are in fact segregate themselves. In Brazilian city, they segregated in building with 24 hours supervisor. They segregated stuff in neighborhood that has nothing to do with the favela. Until the 1990s, the map of Rio didn't have favelas at all, didn't have the poor neighborhood. They have only the official neighborhood, what they call asfaltado, with asphalted street. So that's what I say, that the exclusion, sometimes the exclusion is the exclusion of the privileged, who exclude themselves among themselves and keep themselves for themselves. And this is when Emilia, our friend, that say there is very little attention that is given in public health debate to the exclusion of the elite. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilana, for those beautiful comments. Now we'll have a few prepared respondents and then open it up for conversation with the room. So first, Professor Anne Kelly.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Hi, Ilana. So it really is an immense privilege to be included in the launch of this momentous manuscript, and I only wish I could be there in person. It's great to see you all regardless. So the book begins with an invitation, and I think more than that, kind of an exhortation to remember, to reflect and to carefully contemplate seemingly past, which seem past, and yet in truth are still persisting and ever more entrenched events. This kind of practice of remembering, which is vanishingly rare, I think, in the context of global health, where emergent predicaments and accelerating crises propel us forward, commanding our attention, demanding ever more immediate solutions. So taking that invitation seriously, I went back through my own records, papers in this yawning chasm of over embarrassingly like 100,000 Gmail messages. It's like, will they ever go away? To excavate my own memories and work on Zika. Completely aware that for me too, the kind of sociological contours and epidemiological trajectories of this truly horrifying and, as Ilana rightly says, kind of complex event had begun to fade from view. And one thing that I had completely forgotten was that it was Zika that had provided the context for my first ever meeting in person of Ilana, which was a truly exhilarating, I think, 2 hours of discussion over coffee and squirreled bags of nuts in my, whatever I could find in my office desk drawer, a conversation that ranged from the politics of evidence, the philosophy of diagnosis, history of immunology, and entomological aesthetics. And I think one of the reasons I found myself so shocked was that this encounter was so recent. Since, to be honest, I've been in conversation really with Ilana for my entire academic career. When I applied to a PhD program in anthropology, I had some idea that I was going to study the history of microscopes in medicine. And my then potential supervisor thought this was all very interesting, but gently inquired as to what would be the focus of my ethnography, because as an anthropologist, we might actually be expected to do field work somewhere, ideally with some people on someone doing something. And as it happened, I had just read Ilana's chapter in an edited volume on the evolution of clinical trials, from drugs for cancer to AIDS. And I was really, quite frankly, blown away. And I hurriedly drafted a 2-page rewrite of my proposal, focusing on how medical evidence is made, a project that would track the complex social event that is the clinical trial. And I could have simply written that I want to do what Ilana does. And it's a desire that would come to structure my intellectual project for decades to come. And I mentioned that kind of deep and abiding debt to Ilana here. And, I recognize that this is an indulgent personal digression, but it's really to highlight the elements of Ilana's truly unique scholarship that makes this book so exceptional. It's not just that Ilana's work is historically situated and theoretically really nuanced, but that it develops from an abiding respect, curiosity, and a robust engagement with scientific and medical and clinical practice, a concern with the distinct set of problems, be they ethical, epistemic, or political, that confront the actors with whom she studies. Though it had been circulating long before, back in 2015, Zika erupted into our global health attention as this really, truly terrifying mystery. The confounding combination of a virus with highly divergent pathologies, a highly domesticated, invasive, and intractable mosquito vector, a suite of really dizzying neurological impacts, devastating congenital abnormalities, generated this sense of terror and real shock, and this crippling sense of ignorance and uncertainty. It was this kind of epistemic deficit that formed the basis for the WHO's decision to call a public health emergency of international concern. What will become clear, or rather disturbingly still unclear in the preceding months, was this kind of tangle of ideological circumstances, vulnerabilities, experiences of suffering that Ilana so elegantly unwinds across the book, that showing that Zika really was a quintessential wicked problem, a cross-sectional complex issue that defies clear formulation, conclusive cause, or ultimate solution. It is in this way that Zika was a kind of demonstration disease, not in the sense that Rockefeller meant it, as a proof of the power of a scientific response to epidemics, but rather a testimony to the importance of social medicine and to the interdisciplinary, politically conscious, ethnographically informed, and historically driven approaches cultivated and carried out in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, in which Ilana and our colleagues sit. Now, needless to say, Ilana epitomizes this approach, and for Zika, I think it's incredible. She really was the expert, in possession of the hugely extensive and rare set of disciplinary skills required to articulate Zika across all of its epidemiological, immunological, entomological, public health, socio-legal, feminist, and historical conjunctions. The book is truly breathtaking in that kind of wide comprehension, and I think stands out as far and away the most rigorous, precise, and truly compelling account of Zika to date, and I would imagine certainly for time to come. But that authority is not simply a feature of the depth and wide-ranginess of Ilana's scientific proficiency, which is profound, but rather it is how that expertise develops from the community of scholars she has nurtured and cultivated. As part of this project, I had the privilege of spending some time with Ilana in Rio, and what became clear, again, though hardly surprising, is the extent of her scholarly impact, the network of scientists whom continually call upon her to collaborate, the public health professionals who seek her advice, the students she has supervised, the multiple lectures and seminars she gave, and classes and kind of conversations that she cultivates. It is that community of inquirers, the insights of the epidemiologists, social sciences, and mothers that structure and animate the book, not as subjects of study, but as collaborators and compañeras whose concerns and convictions she gives pride of place. Because, as Ilana so deftly shows us, Zika is not a problem Zika is a problem that must be recognized, understood, and confronted from the ground. Whether the response involves insecticidal sprays, building better homes, proceeding suits in the courts, finding disability support, the development of new diagnostics, vaccines, access to reproductive health care, forms of pursuing gender equity. These solutions may all share an objective, but demand distinctive skills, investments, and communities of practice. Above all, Zika is a problem that demands a fully fledged sanitary imagination, one capable of apprehending the manifold and intersecting forms of stratified injustice, racism, histories of statecraft, and styles of public health reason. Global health, as we are all too aware, tends to start from a position of radical dislocation. The scientific knowledge and technical platforms that underpin its programs are typically produced far away from their context of use, in institutional places that are distant, geographically and existentially, from those actors who are expected to benefit from their application. Much global health work, therefore, is focused on linking up far-flung and disparate spaces of agency, on creating, often from scratch, practical and moral connections between science and the constituencies it is meant to serve. All too often, however, this attempt to stitch up differences fails and unravels quickly, short-circuited not by technical limitations of technologies, but by a fundamental disconnect between the problems they are engineered to address and those that matter to the people whose lives they seek to change. In contrast, the style of global health work pursued by Ilana, and just so beautifully epitomized by this book, is the formulation of problems, of creating points of interception between received logics and divergent points of view, creating the kind of humble, I mean, literally close to the ground, and yet fearless scholarly conviction that animates collective action. We have so many problems that are crippling in their urgency and immensity, problems to which a response must be given. Ilana shows us that we have to take seriously that we have something to contribute, something to learn and something to add, a contribution that can at one hand be understood as an act of memory, the work of, she quotes, a Rembrandtser, who ensures we don't forget, but also as a task of problematization. She is a great problematise, I would say, who helps us craft the kind of problems that are capable of provoking genuine responses from those to whom the consequences of those responses matter most. This is the great achievement of this book and the standard of scholarship that Ilana models for us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Rishita.
Thanks, Anne. You'll hear a lot of echoes, I think, in what I say, reflecting on what Anne said as well. So first, I think, Ilana, thank you so much for this book, not just for now setting a new standard for all reproduction scholars to try and get a Paula Rego work on their book cover, but also for exactly what Anne was saying, this being this remembrancer, something that you evoke in your preface, that it's a duty to remind people of what they would like to forget. And I think for me, this book is not just that, this remembrance, but it's also, for me, this task of feminist social science, which is to make visible the injustices that one might rather not see, rather not confront. And I think, again, this is what this book really sets out so clearly. And I'll focus on the second part of your interrogation, reproductive injustice. And I think this book is such an astonishing read. At this point, I feel I'm fairly inured to a lot of reproductive injustices that I've read about, learned about, witnessed, studied, researched. But reading this very careful unpicking, this cumulative nature that Ilana sets out in this book, I was, in a lot of moments, still quite heartbroken at just how pervasive, how embedded this is. And you do this not just in thinking about the reactions or the responses to Zika. And Zika here is really a lens for how these everyday pervasive conditions gave rise to these reproductive injustices in this very specific moment of Zika, how it was impacting people and how it sustained and reproduced and embedded this injustice for much longer, I think. And it's something that you underscored in your presentation and throughout the book as well, that while these conditions, these reproductive injustices, hold for all women in Brazil, they're particularly borne out on poorer women, on racialized women. And again, you highlight how this observation that you made earlier, that the majority of children with microcephaly were born to poor women, and that this was something that was explained away as tied to risk of exposure of where you are, the lack of mosquito repellents, compromised immune system, and a number of other factors. But that abortion and contraception wasn't something that came up to explain this difference, that this was something that was linked to class and affluence. And again, for me, as a reproduction scholar, that was the first explanation. So I found it quite interesting because what I think you point to in this book is that the first invisibility of grappling with epidemics is when this focus on viruses, on causes, on transmissions, all very, very important things. And then it shifts to thinking about how do we care for people. So again, as you highlight, how our discussion, the narrative frames of Zika then shifts to caring for children with congenital Zika syndrome. It overlooks then sexual and reproductive health. and this is something that we really saw again with COVID-19 and the responses to COVID-19. It came much, much, much later on, when many people had experienced a lot, had been impacted so much by the pandemic around their sexual and reproductive health. And so really Zika and its impact on women's lives sits in this context of reproductive injustices. And you detail so, like in a really forensic way, how abortion remains criminalized in Brazil, with some exceptions. And this is similar to many, many other countries where abortion remains criminalized and inaccessible. And that this does not mean that abortions don't take place. Of course, again, as you say, more resourced and affluent women are able to pay for safer abortions or travel to access these abortions, options that are unavailable to poorer, more vulnerable women. You also highlight how mifepristone, which is on the WHO's essential medicines list, is banned, which then makes not just access to even legal abortions in hospitals and clinics more difficult, it makes the abortion experience harder and harsher, it also makes this space of how do you access an abortion much more complex and fraught. You talk about the judicial review, so when people go to a judge in order to access an abortion, and here again we see this reproductive injustice play out from the micro going right up to the macro level, where delays may mean that by the time you have an approval for an abortion, someone has already given birth and the child has died. All of these experiences of reproductive injustice are not just in the singular moment, not just through that lens of Zika, but are cumulative. They occur over someone's life course. They occur very much situated in their context. You detail again how the favelas, coming back to that point you were making around exceptionalizing, around what is excluded, and what we pay attention to. And we understand that these are the conditions in which women access abortions, whether in public hospitals, in more upscale clinics when they're able to raise money to travel outside favelas, the clandestine clinics in the favelas, as well as through the use of cytotech, so medical abortion, here just misoprostol. How even purchasing these drugs, which now in many other contexts we're saying, well, this has allowed abortion to be in women's hands, in women's control. But we're seeing here how that too doesn't hold, that in order to access and purchase these drugs, it would require a man to buy them for them so they can use it. We see again how this control over women's fertility are tied to such strong gendered norms that operate in this space. Again, in discussing how post-abortion care experiences in hospitals, when women go into hospitals to try and seek care, they're treated really poorly, they receive lots of stigma and shame. Doctors are quite rude, there's forms of obstetric violence in here, and they're treated very much with contempt, which shape not just that specific experience of trying to access care, but subsequent experiences. So the next time you need an abortion, you may not go back. And all of this, for me, was very, very familiar. These are things that I see in my work in India, where abortion is legal, but the very same narratives of how do you access care when abortion itself remains tied to such strong gendered norms around motherhood, around caring, even around suffering, as you point out. And so when we see with Zika, again, as you point out, like in this context of trying to access care, trying to make decisions, and you quote here a midwife, Biku Fernandez, who says, "Damned if you do and damned if you don't." And I think this, again, speaks to how reproduction and how gender permeates even our understanding of how do we deal with epidemics, how do we deal with an entrenched problem like this. And as you say, all of this really sits along this valorization of motherhood, where being a mother holds such social, religious, and cultural value. And again, I found this really affecting to read when you detail with such care how women, when they're confronted with a fatal fetal diagnosis, and they want to continue their pregnancies because it helps them feel like a real mother. How breastfeeding is still implicated in this space. And you show this amazing piece of reflexivity there where you start out by saying, isn't that quite heartbreaking that somebody would want to breastfeed when they've lost a child? But how this act of breastfeeding is still tied to this notion of validating you as a mother, or waiting to see if a diagnosis will shift, this space of liminality and how it allows possibility. And I think all of this speaks not just to how limiting the frames that we have around abortion are, that an abortion for a fetal abnormality would be a given. But to me, it really questions how we understand pregnancy itself. We see this very clearly when you reflect on this idea of planning your pregnancy, right? The responsible thing to do in this context of Zika would be to delay your pregnancy. In a context where contraception is not easily available, again, stratified. But planning a pregnancy is also a really fraught framing, because sometimes we don't really plan a pregnancy. You plan for a child. You have hopes and dreams about this child that's going to come into your world. And again, through this, it makes visible how bodies are understood, how gendered pregnant bodies are framed. And I think, again, with this idea of the responsibilization, clean your home, the sanitize the space, again, it holds that body responsible, the gendered female body responsible, for like a global epidemiological order that you need to control, not just the space, but also your body in order to meet this broader set of needs. And I think it's in this really complex set of conditions that you lay out chapter by chapter. You do this historically, epidemiologically, entomologically, through this remembrance. And I think when you set so clearly this failure of how we talk about abortion as a choice. Abortion is tied to this individual decision that somebody makes about their bodily integrity, about their privacy, and how this framing doesn't hold here, particularly when it's tied to this idea of the suffering mother, of motherhood as valor, as motherhood as important to women, to their religious beliefs, but also the cultural standing that it holds. Again, this isn't just true for Brazil. I see this again in my own work, and here exactly is where I think your evoking of injustice works so well. And for me, this is exactly what reproductive justice is, which is a concept articulated by Black American feminists, Sister Song Collective, where they argue that abortion is not the only thing when we talk about reproduction, that it's the right to have a child, to not have a child, and to raise your family and your children in conditions that sustain them. And here is really where I think this articulation of seeing these unjust conditions works, because we see so clearly that for some women, abortion is just not a choice. It's not a choice if it becomes your only option, or a choice if there are no choices available for you in the first place. And here again, you shift this location of abortion as an individual act. You tie it to the sense of relationality, this relation to the fetus, to this child that you have imagined, this idea of you as a mother linked to your relationship with your community, with God even. And I think here is where we start seeing this emergence of this idea, this very problematized idea of care. Not to romanticize it, not to, again, as we see towards the end of Ilana's book, where she's talking about how Zika, the frames of Zika shift then to caring for these children. But seeing abortion as an act of care, potentially for some, but also through this notion of care, being able to see, or uncaringness, being able to see how these matrices of oppression, the social stratification, how patriarchy, class, whether you have access to contraception or not, access to diagnostic techniques, they all shape what choices are available to these women. And in this, I think you come towards the end to really talking about how this idea of community, what is the space, the conditions in which we live and we raise our families, comes to bear. Particularly when you're talking about raising and caring for children with congenital Zika syndrome. And towards the end, also as in your presentation, where you talk about how they're not passive recipients of these conditions, that they actively organize, politically engaged, and that they're building a community, not just within this idea of caring for their children, or even drawing on this idea of motherhood and valorizing the idea of motherhood, but how care here is also a form of survival, of speaking back to these injustices that they endure and that they try to negotiate and work around, but also this invisibilization, this forgetting. And I think really this is what Ilana does in this book. Not just a form of remembrance, not just a challenging of a taken for granted frame or narrative, but she makes visible how all of these complex, contradictory, political, and personal webs shape not just these reproductive injustices that shape so many of these lives, but also where there is the possibility and this hope that we might not forget it, and so we might then change it. Thank you, Ilana.
Thank you. And finally, Reina.
Thanks so much to Anne and Rishita and Lucy for organizing this great book launch. And thanks above all to Ilana for your fantastic book, Viruses and Reproductive Injustice, Zika in Brazil. It's a fascinating, deeply researched, harrowing, and politically passionate book, as the prior speakers have all made clear. You always provide a model for how anthropologists should lengthen our focus to embrace the complex public health history that shadows, shapes, and constrains the experiences of all the diverse actors in our research terrain in the present, wherever we work. There are benefits and burden to going last, so forgive me if I repeat some of the praise and the analysis that both Anne and Rishita have already contributed. But I want to start by saying that the very placement of the words reproductive injustice in the title before the colon says it all, or just about all. From the get-go, Ilana describes a landscape of obstetrical disdain and violence toward the sexual practices and needs of low-income pregnant women in SUS hospitals, the witch's house as an alternative when they need to end a pregnancy, and the extreme male control in the favelas, even over abortion medication. This was the background against which the harrowing and rapid epidemic of microcephaly, or CZS, played out in the Northeast, and it rarely led to public discourse or mobilization for reproductive justice for women. Instead, progressive forces rightfully pointed out the loss of mosquito control and the spotty nature of sanitation. All that was true, but Ilana insists on adding the missing key ingredients that would contribute to devastating outcomes for women and then their children. In the Northeast, where the overwhelming majority of CZS babies occurred, their mothers-to-be were already steeped in the experience near conjunction of poverty, poor nutrition, multiple infections, paltry mosquito eradication, all of which had shaped the Zika pregnancy experience. But that shaping, Ilana insists, must take into account the structural violence legislating women's lack of reproductive health resources, many dependent on intersectional national politics, the lack of widespread access to safe, effective, women-controlled contraceptive, spotty public health campaigns largely silent about the risk of sexual transmission to pregnant women, also increasingly thwarted by the turn to the extreme right by Brazil's government, which had earned international admiration for its earlier alliance with HIV/AIDS campaigns. And therefore, the neoliberal urge that's throughout the posters, I love the poster you put up, Ilana, thank you, of tutoring women to be careful around mosquitoes and to delay their pregnancy as if they had control over such things. There were no prenatal screens for those who knew they had been exposed, with the large exception of well-to-do, predominantly urban Brazilian women who could access multiple diagnostic technologies like ultrasound at private clinics. And above all, there was no mass movement to reform abortion laws, insisting on the rapid provision of this form of health care in SUS services. Chapter 2, I think Rishita was referring to this too, sells some of the worst abortion stories that we're pretty much veterans of reading dreadful stories about abortion and violence against women's reproductive selves. But some of these stories that litter the landscape of contempt for girls and women in this book are really extraordinary and painful to read. Anencephaly, incestuous rape, it doesn't matter the cause that female suffering involves. The right-wing religious coalitions erect barriers to ending any unwanted pregnancies. And of course, the judgment of religious practitioners, governmental institutions, seemingly neutral NGOs, and popular culture braid together the patriarchal disdain for women that valorizes only maternity, casting a socio-cultural shadow over any, perhaps all, discussion of abortion. Ilana stresses that for many mães de micros, the mothers of the microheaded, microcephalic, small-headed babies, the severe problems of getting help for their pregnancies, for their newborns and young children affected by Zika are molded by a familiar trope: saintly Madonnas sacrificing everything to care for their needy children. Many are accepting of this cruel cultural idealization of motherhood. Yet for women of means, whatever their religious or political orientation, escape hatches are widely available. Discreet, safe, technologically up to date, if you can pay, and if you believe in your own decision-making capacity. These gaps tear through the system, and women's bodies fall through. It's a harrowing chapter in the book, and it sets the stage for the misinformation, disinformation, non-information available or unavailable to pregnant women of the Northeast, those most likely to give birth to a microbaby. Around the edges are attempts by a popular funk group, the Anis Film, to open channels of public education and small but important public health campaigns that not only stress sexual transmission of the virus, which had pretty much been a taboo subject, but also targeted men as potential fathers. There were strong feminist protests against individual woman blame, as if everyone were a neoliberal individual with the resources to invest in her own mosquito control, unequal power in heterosexual relationships, contraception, prenatal screening with multiple technologies, and the like. And unspoken and unobtainable was the fact that only much richer women could seek an abortion when they deemed it necessary. Ilana is sympathetic to all these grassroots movements, but on the whole, she deems them too small to have widespread efficacy. She documents a failed campaign for abortion reform in the shadow of Zika, analyzing its differences with other Latin American movements that have recently succeeded. And at a time when in the US we've lost Roe to a post-Dobbs world presided over by our extremely right-wing, predominantly Catholic Supreme Court jurists and many sadistic MAGA state legislators, I yearn to have some hope in those small social movements. Of course, as a North American, I yearn to know more. We all valorize, perhaps romanticize, the mass mobilization in Brazil that led to widespread HIV/AIDS care and earlier moments of the Brazilian feminist movement, brimming with creative outreach that aspired to cross class chasms. But social movements, of course, only plant seeds. They do not necessarily develop into gardens, especially when the environment is so politically desiccated. I think that Ilana would argue, however, with a relentless class analysis. But here she turns the class question on its head, asking not why so many lower class Northeastern women living under conditions that made them extremely vulnerable to this arbovirus birth babies with CZV suffered the consequences. Rather, she asks, how did middle and upper class women escape their gendered vulnerability? Why was the birth of babies with CZV so much rarer among women of the urban middle classes? To this radical interrogation of what lies hidden in the shadows, unsurveilled, the answer is, of course, stratified reproduction, not only in safer housing with better mosquito bite prevention, including air conditioning, better negotiating power in heterosexual relationships, and on average, more robust health prior to and during pregnancy. To all this must be added stratified access to early detection by multiple screening technologies in private clinics and access to private, safe, and illegal abortion. Reproductive injustice dwells in a class and gendered health system that makes abortion a profitable and humane prerogative for women and their physicians of the most privileged strata. Yet that story can't stop here. And Ilana also engages with the more utopian desires of some very, very wonderful researchers and writers, including Deborah Denise and her allies, all articulate goals for a pair of possibilities that include respectful, good pregnancy, reproductive health care for women, and also care available to those women who do choose to go ahead with pregnancies in which they will have a profoundly disabled baby. But we are far from that place. This utopian goal is very far from what Ilona also describes as the discarded cases, as differences in the metrics used to accept claims for government resources were negotiated across bureaucratic, rather chaotic entities. Under these real-time conditions, follow-up in the lives of maestro micro and their children is barely possible. Yet their needs as caregivers and care receivers will surely evolve over their life courses. Ilana ends with COVID-19, both its refraction of class inequalities in morbidity and mortality, and its stark gendered reproductive differences from Zika, on whose immediate legacy it was being built in Brazil. Here, I want to pivot for a moment toward the recent work Faye Ginsburg and I have been doing. Some of our questions are now focused on the challenges that Alison Kafer poses in her book, Feminist Queer Crip, asking us to, quote, welcome a disabled future. The question of follow-up is both empirical in the present and ethical and global for the foreseeable future, as those with IDD, intellectual and developmental disability, and others needing long-term significant support age, along with their caregivers and the institutions ill-prepared to accommodate them and their needs. In the last chapter of the book we are finally publishing, Disability Worlds, due out in May, and in a chapter that covers that same ground in a co-edited book called How to Be Disabled in a Pandemic, talking about COVID in New York City in 2020 through 2022, when so little was available. The co-editors, Mara Mills has taken the lead, and Harris Kornstein and Faye and I are part of it. That one comes out from NYU Press next winter. But Faye and I have reconnected with the families that had an adult member with intellectual developmental disabilities. Most were mothers and some were fathers we'd interviewed initially when their children were school age. In a context of dramatic loss of care and services and extreme medical vulnerability during the early years of the pandemic, they described their hopes and fears about who would offer support for their loved ones as they themselves became too old or might shortly meet their deaths by COVID-19. In the US, the question of viable, respectful home and care for people with IDD beyond their aging families looms large. While there are some small-scale communities and housing projects that extend such care quite brilliantly, for the vast majority, and certainly for people of low and modest means, this frightening question of forward-facing care, futurity and care, can be overwhelming. When and where will there be a political analysis, the mobilization, and the resources to address this question? This, of course, echoes in research in Brazil. I'm thinking here of the work recently done by Helena Fitz, who earned her PhD, working with Claudia Fonseca at the Universidade Federal de Rio Grande do Sul in Porto Alegre, allied with families with young adult members with IDD and organizations that attend to the support needs and huge resource constraints facing them as parents, overwhelmingly mothers, as they themselves aged. Despite the many differences in wealth, legislation, and sociocultural orientations and resources between the US and southern Brazil, Helena's engaged research also highlights the problem of disabled futures. The Zika epidemic was a mass disabling event for what turned out to be a much smaller and more specifically class and regionally bounded group of women and their children than initially predicted and feared. COVID, of course, continues to create new waves of disabled people shaped by access and acceptance of vaccination and class and regional access to medical care. Like the past, present, future of all epidemics so skillfully analyzed by Ilana in Viruses and Reproductive Injustice, it will have consequences that entail the too often hidden labor of family and paid caregivers, overwhelmingly low-income women of color, and in the US likely to be immigrants. Ilana's book beckons us to study and to intervene in the long-term patterns of gendered, classed, and disabled futures that each epidemic and now pandemic constructs. Thank you for your book.
So thank you so much for these amazing responses. Ilana, would you like to respond to them?
I just want to thank a lot everybody. I mean, all the three interventions. And I wanted to say, I didn't say it in the beginning of my talk, but of course, I have a huge depth of lot of people writing this book. And, you know, certainly for Reina, because without her, I wouldn't ever start in the area of reproductive studies. I mean, really, because I met Reina, I became interested. Certainly to Anne, who make me understand what global health really means in political terms. But there is a long list of people that I am thankful for in the introduction to my book. And it's not because I am polite. Okay, there are a lot of people who, without them, I couldn't make this work done.
Are there any questions or comments from the room? Or from online? Do you know? There's the chat.
Just what's the life expectancy of the baby? What is the life expectancy of
The babies with.
what's the yeah? I mean, what
That's a really interesting question, because when I was quite shocked. A lot of things that I shocked. It was not an easy book to write because there were a lot of rather very depressing stories in it. But one of the things that when 2015 in August and September they start to have these microcephaly cases, and then I asked people, and then they started to make prenatal diagnosis of this severe, this not only necessarily microcephaly, it's disappearance of brain stem and microcalcification, but they started to make, and I showed these photos of the fetuses to expert in one person, which was my contact, probably the best expert of fetal brains in Brazil, and then I did the same thing in Paris because my previous book was on prenatal diagnosis, and I knew the woman who is the biggest expert on fetal anomalies, brain anomalies in France, and both say me, and they say, what will happen to these children? And would they die? Would they live? And they say they will live, but they will be extremely severely handicapped because without brain stem, you'll have a usually very severe handicap, and they will live at least some years, but probably some of them quite long time with severe handicap. So this information exists, and they knew it because it's happened in other disease conditions as well. This information never was diffused in Brazil. It was diffused in France. In the Ministry of Health, a description of Zika, they say they will have severe brain anomalies, but most of these children will be born alive and will live with these severe brain anomalies. It was never transmitted from the expert to gynecologists in Brazil. They were told, half of them believed that the child will die a few months after birth, and the other half believed that with good training, what they call early stimulation, they can catch up. It was never transmitted. So this is the point. Now, what happened to the children? Unfortunately, one of true tragedies that Raina spoke, and I know the work of Claudia Fonseca, and I know Claudia, so I discussed what happened, and she worked on, one of the things she looked was what's happened with Zika children, with the Zika during the COVID epidemics. A lot of them died, not necessarily from COVID, but from break of the chain of care.
Mm-hmm.
So that now about 1/3 of the child, that I heard recently, died. But some of them lived until now, this is 6-7 years after the pandemic. Now it's going to 8. Many are still alive. Not all the children. I mean, some children have only light, or what you call different type of handicap. The woman who is the, Mothers of Angel was Maes of Años, this organization from Recife, very big. It has a charismatic leader, and the charismatic leader is a woman called Germana Soares. Her child has Zika syndrome, but let's say from the lighter facility. He's like child with development difficulties, but not like these children who are completely unable to move and to feed themselves and so on. But so there are cases of much less severe brain anomaly. By the way, the less severe can be detected. I mean, you can detect it mostly prenatally. I mean, the very severe you can detect. But they survive, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Ilana. I can't wait to read the book, and thank you to the discussants for this very insightful feedback and views on the book. I wanted to ask you, besides your voice and your interventions in the debate, have there been other voices seeking to frame these issues in terms of reproductive rights and reproductive justice in Brazil?
Oh, yeah, there is a whole chapter in my book, half of it. But it was, people like Deborah Denise. Deborah make a wonderful, I was, by the way, expert on the plea of her organization, which was called Denise, to make an exception for abortion, allowing abortion in case of Zika. It took 4 years for the Supreme Court to reject it. It was rejected. But yes, of course, the organization that I mentioned in my book, Kurumim, was a very good organization in Recife, but teeny. It's really one woman, Paula Viena and her friends. There was ANIS, which is the Institute of Human Rights. They make an exemplary fight for enlarging abortion right. It didn't work. There was the party, the left-wing party, one of the left-wing party, which is called the Socialism and Freedom. They make a plea in the parliament. There was a second plea for the Supreme Court. So yes, there were a lot of initiatives. They, for the moment, failed, but we never know. Maybe the next one will work.
Hi, thank you, Ilana, for the brilliant presentation and the book, and for the speakers as well. My question is more around language in terms of the book and the presentation. I noticed that you use more the term, especially in the chapter talking about the inequalities when it pertains to race and to class and gender, that you mostly use the term non-white as you did in the presentation. And I was wondering, I wanted to hear your thoughts on the implications, I would say the benefits or the downsides of using a term such as non-white, which some could argue that still centers whiteness rather than to say that most of the women affected were Afro-Brazilian or Black Brazilian. Do you think that that could make it invisible, or especially for the population outside of Brazil who might not be aware of the makeup of race in Brazil? Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is complicated because I don't have the English word. The English word is padra, it's brown. There were most of the Brazilian, more than 50% of the Brazilian, are either Afro-Brazilian or what we call padra, brown woman. Brown woman, but this is a big story. Race in Brazil is conceptualized very differently that it will be conceptualized, for example, in the United States. I can speak an hour about it, which I will not. But the problem is that on the one hand, Brazilians are proud of mixed Brazilian heritage. There was the story when they make genetic tests, what they call molecular portrait of Brazil, and they try to find out what is the origin. There are so-called genetic markers of African origins, and there are genetic markers of European origin, whatever it means. And then they make this kind of, this was a very famous research. They ask people, do you classify yourself? In the census in Brazil, there are 3 categories: white, brown, and black. They ask themselves, what you classify yourself? So they say, I classify themselves so and so. Then they ask the people who took their blood for testing, what you will classify this person. And it was like more than 90% agreement between the person classified themselves and the objective, so-called objective classification of the researcher. Then they look on the genes, and there was about 0 coordination, which is absolutely different than the United States. In the United States, you have, it's not, of course, not absolute, but people who are classified themselves in the census as black will have more so-called African genetic markers. In Brazil, nil, 0. And the reason is they never had a 1 drop of blood rule. So if you have a couple, say, let's say, classical case, white man, black woman, they have 4 children, Mendelian distribution, 1 look white, 1 look black, and 2 who look brown. Now the one who look black and he has social advantage will consider white in the society. It doesn't matter that he has a black woman. There is a famous picture in National Gallery, rescue of Ham. They saw the family when one black woman and the child is mixed race and marry one other, and the next white person, and the grandchild is the black grandmother look with admiration on the completely white blonde grandchild. He was saved. So the idea is that in mixture, and it was the whole movement in Brazil in the late 19th and early 20th century, whitening Brazil through immigration. And the whole idea is, but if you see people who wear mixed color, if they have light skin and they have money or education or both, they were considered white. And if they married 2 mixed blood people who look more or less white and have the same proportion of black genes that the black-looking child from the same marriage, well, they were considered, next generation, the children were considered completely white. But the markers are not markers of, biological markers are not markers of skin. They are markers of blood, of liver, enzymes, of whatever you want. conclusion that because there was never a rule that one drop of blood or even one parent black make you black, or one parent, they became a total mixture which make a total dissociation between markers of African descent and the skin color, which make, and the reaction for this was fantastic. And the same thing for white people. White people had black genes. The reaction was, you'll guess what? The white people told that they have black blood. You know what their reaction was? Their reaction was, we are real Brazilians. There is an expression in Portuguese, I have one foot in the kitchen. I mean, I have slave descendants, great. Many black people descended, oh, what a horror. I have, in fact, the same genetic making that my white neighbor. It means that this is the history of systematic rape. So, I mean, the problem is, and we are black and we are proud of our black heritage, and now they tell us we are genetically white. What does it mean? So what I wanted to say, that in Brazil, the race, skin color and race is taken extremely differently than in the United States, or let's say in India or in other places like this.
Yes, all right.
Is it true?
Let's take one more question, and then go on to the wine and informal conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm really overwhelmed and excited. I'm doing my PhD as an ethnography of families raising children with congenital Zika syndrome in Colombia. And I just feel like my whole PhD journey is in this room right now, that Testing Women, Testing the Fetus was one of the first books that I've read. Rishita has been a constant presence, and then now discussing your amazing book. I just really wanted to say thank you so much. I've been putting off writing my introduction for about a year with no really good excuse to do that, and now I know it's because sort of been waiting for this brilliant resource to come out that's, for me, kind of follows straight on from Deborah Denise's book that takes us up to 2015, 2016, to now have the kind of reflections from afterwards from a reproductive justice perspective is, yeah, just incredible. I kind of came to the topic from a reproductive justice lens, thinking about more the pregnancy and diagnosis side, and have ended up kind of on the third pillar maybe of raising children and the ability to do so in a supportive environment for these kind of really poor families raising children with really complex impairments. I just wanted to share a reflection that that stratification continues. The families that I was working with, their children are 5, 6, 7 years old, and among their group of mothers in the city, the ones with resources have left to go somewhere with more resources. So they would talk about, oh, we had one mother, she was amazing, this great organizer, and she was a lawyer, but she's moved to the United States now to get better access to care, or another mother in the group had moved to the capital city to have greater access. So just a tiny reflection that kind of stratified ability to parent and raise the child that you have, I've seen it kind of continue even way beyond the kind of point of pregnancy and birth and diagnosis. But yeah, mainly just to say thank you so much. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any closing words?
No, just thank everybody, and we can talk with having a glass of wine.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ilana. It was wonderful. Thank you, Anne, Rishita, Lena, everyone. I'm going to go get my Uber.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful reception.
Thank you.